So this lecture is over 1.2, Symbolic Logic, and I decided to mix it up a little bit. Instead of using the PowerPoint, I'm going to put it in OneNote and kind of go through the PowerPoint. So not every slide that's on the PowerPoint will be on OneNote, but the slides that I cut were stuff that you could read and hopefully understand as we go. So today we're going to talk about symbolic logic, and we're going to identify simple statements, and that's in the PowerPoint, so you can read over that, what makes a statement a statement. We're going to focus on expressing compound statements in symbolic form, creating a negation of a statement, and express a conditional statement in terms of necessary and sufficient conditions. And generally students get caught up on this, but hopefully I'll show you a trick that makes it straightforward. So the negation of a statement is simply denoted as this tilde in front of the statement. So we'll let the statement be P, it is snowing. The negation of that would be tilde P, and that would be written out as it is not snowing. So P is defined as it's snowing, tilde P would be defined as it is not snowing. So negation is pretty straightforward. Where it gets a little bit confusing is when you have these qualifiers, all in some, no in some. So refer back to this chart. This is figure 1.29 in your book, and if you refer back to that, if you have a statement that's set up as all P are Q, the negation of that statement would be some P are not Q. Some P are Q, the negation of that would be no P are Q. And this takes some practice. If you memorize this table, if you memorize this chart, if you make sense of this chart, then going forward it shouldn't be too bad. And we'll have some examples of this later on. So you could skip to that and look at the examples if this is not your first time watching it. The next thing we're going to talk about is a conjunction. And a conjunction is defined with this little up caret. A conjunction consists of two or more statements connected by the word and. We use the symbol to represent the word and, thus the conjunction P and Q represents the compound statement P and Q. So I always like to think of this as I went to the party and I had ice cream and cake. So if P was I ate ice cream and Q was I ate cake, then if I wanted to represent that in a conjunction, it would be a conjunction. If I wanted to represent that symbolically, I would have P up caret Q, and that would stand P and Q. Not to get confused with a disjunction is a statement connected by the word or. So I had ice cream or I had cake. Typically, I like to think the and is better, so it goes up and the or goes down. So that's one thing you need to keep in mind. You need to remember that this symbol means and this symbol means or. So whatever you like to think about it, I always think of ice cream and cake. I'd rather eat ice cream and cake than have to pick ice cream or cake. So I say this goes up for the conjunction and this goes down for the disjunction. So the disjunction P or Q represents the compound statement P or Q. In mathematics and in logic that we're going to study, P or Q means P or Q or both. So it's a true statement if I had ice cream and cake to say I had ice cream or cake. But if I only ate ice cream and I said I had ice cream and cake, that would be a false statement. So later on we're going to talk about truth tables. So in 1.3, we're going to talk about truth tables, and it's going to come in handy to understand that P is true, Q is true, or both is true for this statement to be true. So that's going to be later on. The next type of symbolic logic we're going to talk about is the conditional. And that is going to be a statement, an if-then statement, and it's represented by an arrow. So we have if P, then Q. And a lot of times P is kind of denoted as the hypothesis and Q is kind of denoted as the conclusion. So if the hypothesis is true, then the conclusion should be true. And later on, that's kind of foreshadowing to 1.3 when we talk about truth tables. Right now, we're going to focus on just writing out a statement in symbolic form. So an example your book gives you, if I exercise regularly, then I'm healthy. So let's let R be the statement I exercise regularly, and P is the statement that I'm healthy. So I could write this compound statement as R arrow P, and I would read that as if R then P. So if I exercise regularly, then I'm healthy. On WebAssign, they will define a symbol for a statement, so that shouldn't be any misguidance there. If you look at the homework in your book, a lot of times they let you make up whatever you want. So you could have this be P and this be Q. You could have this one be S and T. It doesn't really matter. So if you look in the back, if you look at the answers in the back of the book, then generally they try to pick something that makes sense. This might be R, this might be H type of thing. So don't get too caught up on the symbols. Another example your PowerPoint gives you is if it is raining, then the streets are wet. The streets are wet if it's raining. So a lot of times you don't see this if, then. So you really, the then is kind of dropped. You have to say, oh, this is the if. So this is going to be my premise. Of my statement, and this is my conclusion. So this would still be R implies P, but the order in the sentence is not what you would expect if premise then conclusion. So be careful with this if. It might not be the very front of the statement, and it might not be a then in the statement at all. So both of these would be symbolized as R implies P, where R is it's raining and the streets are wet, but it doesn't have to be in that order in the sentence, and that's very important to know. So you want to say, oh, this is the if, so this is the premise, and then the conclusion is not, then is not written, but it's understood that if it's raining, then the streets are wet. The streets are wet if it's raining, so don't get caught up on the order in the sentence. Now we can kind of mix these together with conjunctions and conjunctions with conditionals. So here, the premise, if all this here is the premise, the premise involves the word and would be the up caret. So I eat junk food, they're calling that Q, and I do not exercise, so if R is exercise, that would be tilde R, while the conclusion can be represented by tilde P. Then I'm not healthy, so not P. Thus, the given compound statement has the symbolic form QN not R implies not P. So generally, and on WebAssign what they'll do, they'll always state the positive. So here, Q is going to represent eating junk food. So eat junk food. So someone that eats junk food. What happened there? R would represent someone that exercises. And P is going to represent someone that's healthy. So someone that eats junk food, Q, and does not exercise, so that would be the negation of exercise, so it would be tilde R. Then, and tells us it's going to be a conditional. So if then tells us it's conditional, this tells us it is a conjunction because it has the word and. The person's not healthy, so not P. It gets a little bit confusing when we talk about necessary and sufficient conditions, so if you read in your book or if you look over your PowerPoint and you're confused, hopefully this little part of the video will help. So if you have the word sufficient, let me grab mine. If you have the word sufficient, be blue. If you have the word sufficient, then what's before it is P. So what goes after here is P. What goes if P, then Q. So P is sufficient for Q. So the statement that's before sufficient is going to go in the premise. and the statement after the sufficient is in the conclusion. So it's still going to be symbolized as P implies Q. Now necessary is different. Necessary, it's flipped, which is cause for some confusion. So necessary, if you notice here, the word or the statement that's before necessary is actually the conclusion. And the statement that is after necessary is actually the premise. So if I say Q is necessary for P, I'm going to write that as P implies Q. For sufficient, I have P is sufficient for Q. I symbolize that as P implies Q. But here it's going to be the conclusion is necessary for the premise. So the premise implies the conclusion. So we'll do some examples of this. So let's look at some examples from your book. So that we're going to look at 3, 9, 22, and 37. And these are very, very similar to what you have on WebAssign. So here, determine which pair of statements are negations of each other. Now, negation is a pretty simple thing. P, it's raining. The negation would be it's not raining. Where it gets confusing is when you have these qualifiers. These all, none, some, and some. So keep in mind, if you remember the little picture we had before, all P are Q. So we have all the fruit are red. So the negation of that would be some P are not Q. So some of the fruit are not red. So A and C are negations of each other. A and C are negations of each other. So negations. None of the fruit is red, so we have no P are Q. The negation of that would be some P are Q. So none of the fruit is red, some of the fruit is red. So these two would be negations of each other. So hopefully that kind of gives you an example of that. Symbolic representation. If a person plays the guitar or rides a motorcycle, then the person wears a leather jacket. So this tells me, if I get out the keywords, I have if then, let me underline that, I have an if then statement and I have an or. So a person plays the guitar. So these are my statements. A person plays the guitar, that's represented as P. Or, so that would be the down caret, rides a motorcycle, so a person rides that would be Q. Then, so that tells me that it's a conditional. So the person wears a leather jacket. A person wears a leather jacket. So that would be R. So A would be symbolically represented as P, down caret Q, arrow R. And that would be written as P or Q implies R. So if P or Q, then R. A person plays the guitar, rides a motorcycle, and wears a leather jacket. So there's no conditional here. There's no if then, so I do not need an arrow. Person plays the guitar, that's just Q. Rides a motorcycle, so that would be and again. Rides a motorcycle, so Q. And wears a leather jacket. So we'd get P and Q and R. So a lot of times in English we don't write the and there, but it's understood. If I say a person plays a guitar and rides a motorcycle, but since I have three things there, they're separated by commas. A person wears a leather jacket and does not play the guitar or rides a motorcycle. So I have and doesn't play the guitar or ride a motorcycle. So this doesn't kind of tells me that it's being distributed through guitar and motorcycle. So a person wears a leather jacket. So that's R. So the first thing I write is R. Again, there's no if then, so I don't have a conditional, so I don't need the arrow. So a person wears a leather jacket, and, so that tells me it would be the up caret. Doesn't, so that tells me that's a negation. Doesn't play the guitar or ride a motorcycle. So play the guitar would be P, ride a motorcycle would be Q, and it's or. So it's important that I understand that this whole thing is negated. So my answer would be R and the quantity or the negation of the quantity P or Q. So hopefully that helps. All motorcycle riders wear leather jackets. Not wearing a leather jacket is sufficient for not playing the guitar or riding a motorcycle. So all motorcycle riders wear leather jackets. So that means if you're a motorcycle rider, you wear a leather jacket. So the all, you kind of have to interpret it as an if-then. So if I say all motorcycle riders wear leather jackets, then I'm saying if you're a motorcycle rider, then you're wearing a leather jacket. So over here, I have a motorcycle riders. Q implies that you're wearing a leather jacket, so that would be R. So again, not all statements are in these nice, pretty if-then. They might be in something like an all, and then you have to kind of interpret it, the English side of it, to say what it's really saying, and then write it symbolically. The last one here is using sufficient. So I'm going to get rid of our little, remember sufficient and necessary. So did I get sufficient? So if I bring this down here, so we'll use this one for the necessary one. That's here. Give us a little bit more space. Okay, so if I'm looking at E and I say this is the word sufficient, so remember sufficient tells me that it's going to be the same. P, Q implies P, Q. So I like to remember it as sufficient, same, so my order is going to be the same as it's in the sentence. So not wearing a leather jacket, so not R, because R is weathering, so not wearing a leather jacket is sufficient. So anytime I have necessary or sufficient, it's going to be a conditional. So it's the same order. Sufficient tells me I'm going to write it in the same order. For not playing the guitar or riding a motorcycle. So not playing the guitar or riding a motorcycle. For not playing the guitar or riding a motorcycle. So E would be represented as not R implies not P or Q. Necessary, on the other hand, necessary here tells me that the order is going to be reversed. So I'm going to have to make up my own symbols here. So let's say R is knowing CPR. The pen doesn't want to work with me. Knowing CPR. And let's say P is being a paramedic. So the order would be R and then P, but the necessary tells us that I'm going to flip the order. See, this would be Q, necessary for P, but I'm going to write that P implies Q. So I'm going to write this as P implies R. So sufficient, the order is going to be the same as it's in the statement. Necessary, the order is going to be flipped. So if I have a premise implies a conclusion, I write that as a conclusion implies the premise. So R is necessary for P. When I write that symbolically, I write P implies R. So hopefully you guys got that. If not, let me know. The last thing we're going to do is changing. Oh, we're going to express the following in words. So did I get, yeah, so I'm going to move my answers down. So let's look at A. So Q would be I recycle aluminum cans. R would be I recycle newspapers. And then down caret is or. So it says, so writing that, I got my order all messed up here. My A is down here now. If I recycle my aluminum cans or my newspapers, then I'm an environmentalist. So that's what that statement is saying. Q or R implies P. B, again, my order got mixed up here. My answers. B would be I am not an environmental. If I am not an environmentalist, because anytime I have the arrow, it's a conditional, and I use the wording if then. So if I'm not an environmentalist, because I have not P, and P is I'm an environmentalist. So if I'm not an environmentalist, then I do not recycle my aluminum cans or my newspapers. So Q or R. Q is aluminum cans, R is newspapers. C is there's no conditional here. There's no arrow, so I don't use if then. I just simply use and or. So the up caret is and. So this is saying I recycle my aluminum cans and my newspapers, or I'm not an environmentalist. So P is environmentalist, so the negation of P would be not an environmentalist. And the last one is, again, a conditional, so I'm going to use if, and then what I have in the beginning, then my conclusion. So if I recycle my newspapers and not my aluminum cans, so R and not Q, then not P, then I'm not an environmentalist. So I hope this video helps, and if you have any questions, just let me know. Good luck with this week's homework assignment.